Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever looked at a country's history and found yourself asking, how did it actually get here? Today, we're taking a deep dive into Pakistan's political journey. And we're really zeroing in on a persistent question. Why has its military been so, deeply involved in its politics? And what does that mean for its future stability? Our source material for this gives us a really comprehensive look at Pakistan's political history, its stability challenges. Our mission really is to pull out the most important insights, kind of give you a shortcut to understanding the roots of this instability, and crucially, what paths might actually lead to a more stable future.
And it's fascinating, isn't it, how interwoven these threads are. History, institutions, even personalities when we talk about a country's stability. We'll be looking at just how deep these patterns go, and it helps us understand not just what happened, but really why it matters so much, particularly regarding the military's role today.
Right. So to really get a handle on the military's role, we kind of have to go back to the very beginning. Our source material lays out several distinct periods, showing us how this whole dynamic evolved, pretty much right from Pakistan's formation.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, newly formed nations often face immense challenges right out of the gate. Pakistan, formed in 1947 as a homeland for Muslims from the subcontinent, was certainly no exception. So it begs this crucial question. What happens when a young nation faces these immediate, really fundamental pressures? Does it create a sort of institutional vacuum?
Exactly. And that seems to be precisely what unfolded in those early years, 1947 to 58. Our analysis points to a genuinely weak democratic setup, unstable civilian governments. Just how fragile were things back then?
Well, imagine this. The country operated without a formal constitution until 1956, running on temporary laws, essentially.
Ooh.
Then you had a serious leadership crisis after Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founder, died in 48. What followed was a string of, frankly, weak and changing successors.
A lot of instability at the top.
Right. And on top of all that, the immediate conflict with India over Kashmir, starting right in 1947. So you've got a nation born into this intense pressure cooker. It seems almost ripe for any organized, powerful force to step into that void.
Okay, so those foundational weaknesses were there from the start. It wasn't long then before the military stepped directly into politics, changing Pakistan's path pretty profoundly. What happened in that next critical period, say 1958 to 1971?
This is really key. This is when we see the first direct military coup, led by General Ayub Khan in 1958. The military didn't just, influence things from the sidelines. They actively took over politics. Elections became controlled, sometimes outright rigged.
So direct control.
Direct control. And a key insight here is that this wasn't just a political setback. It actually ingrained a really problematic precedent into the national thinking. The idea that the military was the ultimate decider of power, even if it meant sacrificing national unity.
And this period led to a real national trauma, didn't it? The source highlights a consequence that still echoes today.
Oh, absolutely. The feeling of neglect in East Pakistan, which of course is now Bangladesh, it escalated dramatically during this military rule. This led directly to civil war. And in 1971, Pakistan split. Bangladesh was formed.
A huge rupture.
A profound split. And that event really solidified military control on the one hand, but severely damaged the democratic foundation on the other. It set that precedent for intervention. It fundamentally changed how governance was even perceived.
So after that split, the next phase, maybe 71 to 99, it sounds like this fascinating tug of war. You had civilian leaders trying to assert control, but the military's influence was always there, like a constant shadow. We saw Zulfikar Ali Bhutto try major reforms, but then he was overthrown and executed by the military.
A stark example.
Yeah, and later, leaders like Benazir Bhutto and Nawaz Sharif, they came to power multiple times, but their governments often got dismissed. It just shows how strong that military influence remained, even behind the scenes.
And what's really striking about that behind-the-scenes influence is how it often led to this profound lack of policy continuity. It perpetuated weak institutions, even when civilians were technically in charge, made long-term planning almost impossible,
Right. Leaving the foundations for real democratic progress just incredibly fragile.
Exactly.
And then, just when you might think, okay, maybe a more stable civilian period is starting, Pakistan saw another direct intervention, really showing that cyclical nature you mentioned. 1999 to 2008, General Pervez Musharraf takes over, rules for nearly 9 years, both as army chief and president. And while he tried some modernization, the source says he also systematically silenced opposition, manipulated politics to keep his grip.
And here's the kind of insidious truth, isn't it?
Yeah.
Each military intervention, even if it claims to be for stability, paradoxically ends up weakening the very civilian structures it says it's protecting, which almost guarantees the conditions for the next intervention. It's this self-perpetuating cycle of fragility.
So it normalizes the intervention itself.
Precisely. Musharraf's rule further normalized that pattern, made it incredibly hard for democratic institutions to genuinely take root, to build public trust. The question for many became less if the military would step in again, but more like when.
Which brings us pretty much to the present day. So from 2008 onwards, civilian rule did return, and democratic governments have actually completed their terms, which, is a significant milestone in itself for Pakistan.
It is, yeah.
But the pressure, it hasn't really gone away. Our material points out the judiciary, the military, intelligence agencies, they still wield significant influence over politics. And the political parties themselves, often very personality-based, the Bhutto family's PPP and Nawaz Sharif's PMLN, Imran Khan's PTI, maybe less about strong policies or deep institutional frameworks.
And that period really raises an important question. Even with regular elections happening, how can true democratic governance flourish under such constant, persistent pressures? You had the weight of frequent protests, leaders being disqualified, weak parliaments, and then compound that with terrorism, ongoing economic crises, foreign pressures. It creates this really volatile environment, an environment where the military's perceived role as a stabilizer can easily be amplified, maybe even seem justified to some.
Okay, so after walking through that history, what does it all boil down to? Our source distills this complex story into several key factors explaining Pakistan's persistent political instability. And yeah, it seems clear the military sits right at the heart of many of them.
Yeah, zooming out a bit, looking at the bigger picture, the single most impactful factor is almost certainly military interference. The analysis is quite clear. The army frequently controls foreign policy, security policy, and has this history of directly overthrowing civilian governments. This pervasive role, it profoundly shapes the entire system. It's almost like a parallel government running alongside the civilian one.
But it's not just the direct coups, right? It's also how that influence kind of subtly weakens other parts of the system, like weak institutions, the judiciary, parliament, election commission. They struggle to be truly independent against such a powerful military.
Exactly.
And then there's corruption. Political leaders often accused of using power for personal gain. That just erodes public trust completely. And that's coupled with what the source calls a lack of political culture. Parties focusing more on personalities than, say, solid policies or building up those institutions makes them inherently vulnerable to outside pressures.
Absolutely. And the source also flags other critical factors that just pile on the instability. Extremism and security issues, for one. Terrorism, religious extremism, constantly challenging peace and governance.
Ooh, huge challenge.
Then there's the poor economy, high debt, inflation, unemployment that fuels widespread public dissatisfaction, creates fertile ground for unrest.
Yeah, makes sense.
And finally, regional conflicts. Those ongoing tensions with India, especially over Kashmir, and the complex relationship with Afghanistan, they create constant external pressure. And that pressure can often be used internally to justify the military's central dominant role in the nation's affairs.
Right, it gives them a constant reason to be central.
And what's really illuminating here is how these different elements create this reinforcing feedback loop. It's quite striking. Military interference weakens institutions, which can then enable more corruption.
Which fuels public dissatisfaction.
And that dissatisfaction, in turn, can be used as a justification for more military intervention. It just perpetuates the cycle.
Wow. So it's this complex web where each factor just makes the others worse. The military's power is both a cause and a consequence of the instability.
Precisely.
Okay, so we've definitely unpacked the why, but what about the how? How does Pakistan move forward?
Our material doesn't just diagnose the problem, thankfully. It also outlines some clear pathways towards hopefully a more stable future. And it emphasizes something important, that Pakistan's instability isn't some inherent flaw in its people, but really a result of these deep systemic issues we've been discussing. Which raises that crucial question. What structural changes are genuinely needed to break this deeply entrenched cycle? The conclusion in our source highlights several critical areas. First, the urgent need for strong and independent democratic institutions. This directly tackles that historical weakness of civilian structures and the pervasive military influence we've talked so much about.
Okay, strengthening the civilian side.
Exactly. And equally critical is achieving a genuine civil-military balance. That means a clear separation of roles and responsibilities, making sure the military operates within the framework of civilian authority, not above it.
Easier said than done, maybe, but essential.
Absolutely essential. And alongside those institutional shifts, the material stresses transparent leadership, vital for rebuilding trust and cutting down on corruption, and also robust public accountability, holding leaders actually responsible for their actions.
Right.
And finally, it emphasizes a fundamental focus on education and the economy, addressing those root causes of dissatisfaction, fostering long-term growth and stability, which hopefully lessens the appeal of non-democratic solutions.
So connecting this back, these aren't quick fixes, are they? They're fundamental shifts. Shifts that would empower civilian governance, reduce the incentives, maybe even the opportunities for military intervention over time.
That's the idea. Building a robust framework that can actually withstand those historical pressures, allowing democracy a real chance to take root and mature.
What a journey we've taken. We've seen how Pakistan's political history is really the story of persistent instability, deeply rooted in weak institutions, yes, external pressures too, but most notably this powerful recurring military influence. And we've just unpacked what our source suggests are the crucial steps needed for a more stable path forward.
Yeah, and this deep dive really shows that understanding these historical patterns, these cycles, is the essential first step towards even imagining a different future. It makes you consider, doesn't it, what societal conditions or maybe what civic actions are most crucial in strengthening a nation's democratic institutions, strengthening them enough to truly resist powerful, historically ingrained forces like military interference over the long term.
That is a powerful thought for you to mull over. We really hope this deep dive has given you a clearer, more informed perspective on this really critical topic. Keep asking those big questions, keep digging, and we'll keep digging for answers too. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive.